Hello, my name is Dr. Hannah Hobson and I'm based at the Department of Psychology at the University of York. So it's the start of October 2024 and shortly we'll be having Developmental Language Disorder Awareness Day. So Developmental Language Disorder, or DLD, is something that we look at in our research here at York, and we've been doing some work over the last few years looking particularly at camouflaging or masking in DLD. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Before I get into camouflaging specifically, I know not everyone's heard of DLD, so I'm going to give you a quick definition and a bit of a description of what these children are like. So developmental language disorder describes a child who has not developed language to the expected degree given that child's age. And that is despite there not really being a good explanation for why these language problems have come about. So there's no clear biological reason for a language problem. So there's no, traumatic brain injury. The child doesn't have a known genetic condition such as Down syndrome that might explain a language problem. They've also had what we'd call adequate opportunity. So it's not that this child has been seriously neglected and not given the opportunity to learn language. So we're kind of looking at a language problem without a good reason for why that's happened. You might have come across DLD in other names. So we used to refer to the same group of children by a number of different names. So you might have heard of specific language impairment, developmental aphasia, expressive language disorder. About 7 years ago, there was a big push to all decide to use DLD because obviously using all these different terms is really not very good if you're trying to raise awareness about this group of children. So if you haven't heard of DLD before, it might come as a surprise to learn that DLD affects around 7% of children. So it's very common. Certainly not 7% of children have a diagnosis. And I suspect camouflaging has a big role to play in the fact that we miss a lot of children who have got language needs. DLD is a lifelong neurotype. So like autism, if a child is autistic, they're going to be an autistic adult. And that's true for DLD as well. So while the language needs may change as the child grows up, they're always going to have language and communication difficulties. So that makes it even more important really that we pick this condition up because it will be impactful for people throughout their life. So this is just a visual summary of the sorts of difficulties we might see in a child or person with developmental language disorder. Different children and people will have different specific strengths and difficulties, so not everyone's going to show all of these different symptoms, but it's quite a useful summary. The ones that I usually highlight when I'm introducing people to developmental language disorder for the first time is that long and complex instructions will be difficult. So DLD affects both expressing yourself but also understanding other people. So long complex sentences will be hard for someone to process if they have DLD, if that information isn't broken down into chunks and people given time to process it. Children with DLD will may have sort of weaker vocabularies or smaller vocabularies than you'd expect for a person or child of their age. They may also experience word finding problems, that sort of tip of the tongue phenomena where they can't quite get to the word they want to say. They may muddle up the orders of words in their sentences or miss out key bits of words, for example, past tense indicators. Some children with DLD will have speech problems. Now, not all children with DLD have speech issues, and that's important. Generally, a child with speech problems, we tend to hear as adults when children are having a speech problem. And those children may get picked up and referred for speech and language assessments. In the absence of speech problems, quite significant language problems can go under the radar. So I like to mention that just so people know. Sometimes it can be really difficult to realise that a child has got DLD. So that's just a little bit about who these children are. Moving on to talking about camouflaging. So we really came to this topic in our lab partly because we were reading about it a lot in relation to autism. So camouflaging or masking describes behaviours that autistic people may do to cover up or minimise how obvious their difficulties or differences are. And it's important to mention that people might do this knowing they're doing it and do it quite purposefully. But for some people, this is quite unconscious. And if you've been doing it for a really long time, it might have become quite automatic. Now, the impact of camouflaging, in the short term, it may mean that people fit into societal norms and may even pass as neurotypical. But we know that camouflaging or masking in autism can be very exhausting. It can disrupt one's sense of identity as you're more or less constantly putting on a performance for other people. If you're camouflaging quote unquote successfully, this may mean that your autistic differences are missed and you're actually delayed in being identified and maybe diagnosed. And overall, we know that if you're doing a lot of camouflaging and masking, this tends to predict poorer mental health. So we were really interested in our lab whether we were seeing anything similar in developmental language disorder, which hadn't been studied at this time. We didn't know anything about camouflaging and DLD. So what we did, and what we're still doing to some extent, we interviewed parents of children with DLD and speech and language therapists who work with children with DLD. And we basically asked them, do you think children with DLD camouflage? What do they do? What do you think the impact of that might be? We're actually still doing some interviews with young people and adults with DLD about their experiences camouflaging as well. And we've also been collecting questionnaire data from more parents. We're developing a new measure to try and quantify camouflaging, and we've had some really helpful feedback on that as well. If you are interested in having a bit of a longer read about our initial findings, do drop me an email and I can send you this paper, which I've just got a little screenshot of here. So it's a bit of a longer report on what we found so far. So what we did find was that camouflaging looked very different from child to child, and different children did different things to camouflage their language needs. So it's very variable. We have attempted to create a little bit of a structure and created some sort of groups for different camouflaging behaviours, which I'll just talk through now. So one group of behaviours were what we call conversational skills. So this included, very simply, do you understand what you're doing? Yes, even when children don't understand what they're doing. So generally, checking understanding with children with DLD, asking them if they understand what they're supposed to do is a bad way to do it, because they will often just say yes, because time has taught them that if they say no, people get frustrated with them. Other forms of conversational skills included phrases such as, I'm just tired today, or, oh, I forgot, or, oh, it doesn't matter. So kind of small, polite phrases that don't give away the fact that the children don't understand something or can't express themselves, but kind of close down an interaction. Children were also very quick to say, I don't know. So just saying, I don't know, would be kind of a conversational tool. You've asked, I've said the answer, I don't know, let's move on. The other conversational tool that I thought was really interesting that came up in a few of our interviews was that children with DLD might steer conversation towards a topic they're quite familiar with. So it might be a hobby or an interest. Because they're actually more familiar with the vocabulary around that topic, so they might be able to have a kind of passable conversation with someone who doesn't know they have DLD. Now, why I find that particularly interesting is because I also work on autism. I think if a child was doing that a lot, it might get flagged as a restrictive or repetitive interest in autism. So it may actually make a child look more autistic than they necessarily are. It's not necessarily that that's all that child wants to talk about, but it's just a sort of safe topic for them that they feel they can manage a conversation around. So we also heard a lot of things about relying on others. So kind of managing to get peers, siblings, parents to do things that supported them to communicate. And sometimes people weren't necessarily aware they were really doing this. So things like finishing your sentence early, leaving off the end of your sentence. People often do just jump in, finish a sentence for you. Repeating the last little bit of the sentence someone just said to you. People will often then repeat it or expand on it. So kind of little things like that meant that people with DLD were sort of able to extract support from those around them. We heard a lot of things that we would probably term avoidance. So that included avoiding particular tasks or forms of play that were too linguistically demanding, or selecting playmates, or avoiding playmates who you couldn't keep up with. So that might mean choosing to play with younger children whose language abilities were more similar to your own, or maybe hanging around the adults who are a bit more accommodating to you. We had reports of people using non-verbal strategies, lots of gesture and pointing. You can get quite far communicating. Relying on those, people might not always realise the extent to which you're relying on those sorts of non-verbal forms of communication. We had reports of some children getting very giddy or silly, or using humour to deflect when they're having a difficult conversation or they don't understand something. Sometimes that would tip into what we'd probably call behavioural problems. For some individuals, they seem to be using other cognitive abilities that are kind of covering up their language problems. So one thing that got mentioned a few times was reading. So parents felt that because their child was a good reader, this kind of covered up the fact they didn't understand what they had read or what they were supposed to be doing in class. Copying is another thing that's come up a lot. So if you don't know what's going on, the teacher said something, but all the other kids are lining up against the wall, you might work out from that, okay, it's probably time for me to go and get my coat and go out to break. Copying also extended to basically looking like you were working. So looking around, what's everybody else doing? I'll try and look like them. So we had one interview with a young man who at college would, pretend to type. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, but everybody was on the computer, so he'd pretend to type. And then very similarly, we had reports from a parent of a much younger child. When everybody was sort of writing and working their school books, he would have his head down and be making marks, but his marks would be squiggly lines. He wasn't actually writing any words. And then finally, we have sort of pro-social strategies. So being very smiley, being very friendly, trying to be very helpful. That can carry you, a lot of favour with your peers and with your teachers. But we had some reports where, speech and language therapists felt they were working with a child that had almost like a very fixed smile, almost like a grimace. And that this was kind of covering up the fact that these children were actually really struggling, but just not wanting to seem so. So why are children with DLD camouflaging? Well, I think the motivations for camouflaging are probably really similar to autistic children and young people and other neurodivergent children and young people as well. So they want to please, they don't want to get into trouble. So I mentioned, sometimes if people have said, I didn't understand that, they may be punished for that. Why didn't you? I've already told you twice. Like, why aren't you listening the first time? If that happens enough, you're just going to stop admitting that you don't understand things because you don't want to be told off. And children and young people want to fit in and be accepted by their peers as well. In terms of the impacts of camouflaging, so we're still at quite an early stage here, but certainly what we've heard so far really aligns with what we know about camouflaging and masking in autism. So this is one example of, an impact on one's personality and one's sense of self. So this was a speech and language therapist who was working with an older adolescent who said, he knows he seems like a really serious person, but that's not him. He loves humour, loves having a joke, fun-loving person, but in a group of friends, the banter is so quick, he can't process everything, he doesn't want to laugh at the wrong thing and seem stupid, so the way he deals with that is just by being silent. And that's his personality in that peer group. The other impact in terms of how people are perceived is that camouflaging and masking can impact perceived level of need. So this was another speech and language therapist who described a situation where they had a teaching assistant sit in on an assessment they were doing with a girl. And at the end of the assessment, the assistant said, well, she's having you on. She's messing you around. She did know the answer to your questions because of the camouflaging and masking, had really underestimated the extent of this child's language problems. And then in terms of the impacts on mental health, so particularly the parents, I would say, really emphasise that at the end of the school day, when their children have been working extra hard to keep up with their language problems, but also keep up this performance of knowing what they're doing and fitting in, it means that they're returning home very, very tired, very, very exhausted and very emotionally sensitive. So this was one parent on the right who talked about this like a Coca-Cola bottle effect. So she's been fizzed up, her daughter, fizzed up all day, and then she gets home and it's like an explosion. So in terms of what we are doing and what we're hoping to do next, so we're still running interviews and collecting parent report data for our camouflaging measure. So we're working on that now. If anyone's interested, if you're watching this, in 2024, we're probably still doing that work. So feel free to get in touch if you want to find out more about how you can work with us on that. If you're watching this in October 2024, you might be in time for DLD Awareness Day, which is on the 18th of October this year. And the theme is Speak Up for DLD. So hopefully you'll see a buzz about that. If we've missed it when you're watching this, don't worry, it comes around every year. So hopefully next October you can get involved in DLD Awareness Day. If you have any questions or any comments or want to share anything, my email is here. It's hannahhobson@york.ac.uk. I hope that's been interesting and helpful. And thank you very much for listening. Bye.